There was a shriek, a massive splash, and then a strange silence settled over the yard, the kind that makes you wonder if even nature itself is trying to process what just happened. 1 second. Karen was tearing across the back edge of my property on a tan-colored ATV like she was filming some low-budget action movie. Her blonde hair was streaming behind her, her mouth stretched open in excitement, completely convinced she was a star of the show. The next second, she vanished beneath the surface of my pond in a tangle of lily pads, muddy water, and incredibly poor decisions. I stood frozen on my porch, coffee mug in hand, honestly questioning whether I had just imagined the entire thing. About 10 seconds later, her head burst back through the water. Green algae clung to her hair. Pond weeds hung from her shoulders, and her eyes were wide enough to look cartoonish. She locked onto me immediately, staring as though I had somehow arranged the laws of physics specifically to ruin her morning. Then she pointed a dripping finger in my direction and screamed, "You're going to regret this," before flinging a handful of pond sludge into the air like it was evidence in a courtroom. That was the exact moment I knew things were heading toward a legal battle. Karen had arrived in our quiet rural community about 6 months earlier, and since then, peaceful living had become little more than a memory. Before she moved in, the loudest sounds around here were songbirds greeting the sunrise and the occasional lawnmower on a weekend afternoon. After Karen showed up, everything changed. Her ATV became the soundtrack of the neighborhood. The engine would roar through the trees, shake windows, throw dust into the air, and destroy every bit of tranquility it touched. She was the type of person who believed property rights only applied when they benefited her. In her mind, if she wanted access to something badly enough, it practically belonged to her already. Her property bordered mine, separated by a stretch of woods and a narrow walking trail I had maintained for years. It wasn't public land. It wasn't community property. It was mine. I used it for evening walks, checking fence lines, and reaching the koi pond I had spent years building by hand. Every stone, every plant, every detail had taken time and effort. That pond was my retreat. It was where I went when I wanted quiet, a place where I could sit, think, and breathe without interruption. Karen saw it once. That was all it took. The moment she decided it looked entertaining. She began racing to the trail on her ATV as if she were preparing for some off-road competition nobody else had agreed to host. At first, I tried handling things politely. That was a mistake. Every conversation followed the same pattern. She would smirk, shrug her shoulders, toss out a sarcastic comment, then rev the engine and leave me standing in a cloud of dust. I installed signs. Private property. Keep off trail. Simple messages. Impossible to misunderstand. Karen responded by tearing one down, snapping in half, and leaving the broken pieces on my front porch like some kind of threat. I filed complaints with the HOA. They ignored every single one. Her cousin Mitch had recently become vice president of the association, and suddenly rules seemed optional whenever Karen was involved. So I did what I usually do when dealing with unreasonable people. I stopped arguing. Instead, I reinforced the boundary markers, repainted every sign, and added reflective tape so they could be seen from a mile away. I installed solar lights along the trail and mounted a camera to record activity, not because I expected anything dramatic, because experience had taught me that people like Karen never admit wrongdoing. They deny, deflect, and rewrite history. I wanted evidence before I needed it. I had lived on that property for nearly 15 years, and protecting it mattered to me. The Saturday everything happened started out perfectly. The morning air was warm, sunlight filtered through the trees, and my coffee tasted exactly the way it should. Then I heard the ATV. The sound was unmistakable. But this time there was something different. Laughter. A whole group of women stood near Karen's property line, cheering and chatting like they were attending a sporting event. It turned out to be her yoga club. Karen stood in front of them wearing a bright pink athletic outfit and oversized sunglasses, acting less like a homeowner and more like a stunt performer preparing for a grand finale. At first, I figured it was just another round of showing off. Then I watched her point directly toward my trail. "Watch this, ladies," she shouted. The moment those words left her mouth, my stomach sank. She slammed the throttle forward and charged straight ahead, spraying dirt behind her as she blasted past every warning sign posted on my property. I jumped to my feet so quickly I nearly dropped my coffee. She entered the trail far too fast. The ATV bounced once, then hit the irrigation trench I had dug a couple days earlier. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't dangerous. It was a shallow drainage trench, maybe 2 feet deep, completely legal and entirely visible in the daylight. But speed changes everything. The front wheels struck the edge and lifted. Then the rear wheels followed. And suddenly the entire ATV left the ground. For 3 unbelievable seconds, Karen was flying. Not figuratively. Actually airborne. Her blonde hair whipped through the air. Her mouth hung open in shock, and the ATV tilted just enough to make it obvious that this story was not about to end gracefully. Then gravity took over. Karen, and the ATV came crashing down directly into my pond. Water erupted in every direction. Lily pads flew through the air. Frogs launched themselves out of the shallows. My koi scattered beneath the surface, like they were evacuating a disaster zone. One of Karen's friends let out such a dramatic gasp that I could hear it clearly all the way from my porch. A moment later, Karen surfaced. She was coughing, sputtering, and flailing around while pond weeds clung to her shoulders. Mud streaked her face, algae dripped from her hair, and she looked less like a homeowner and more like someone who had just lost an argument with nature itself. Her expensive jacket was soaked through. One boot had disappeared somewhere beneath the water. Her designer sunglasses were gone. And judging by the trail of bubbles rising near my koi, her phone had officially become part of the pond ecosystem. The first thing she did wasn't ask for help. She didn't apologize. She didn't check whether she had damaged anything. Instead, she pointed directly at me and accused me of causing the entire thing. According to Karen, I had somehow engineered her crash. I had to step inside the house for a minute, not because I was upset, because I was dangerously close to laughing right in front of her. By the time I returned, one of her friends had already called the sheriff. Karen had also managed to transform herself from embarrassed trespasser into decorated survivor of a major catastrophe. Suddenly she had an injured ankle. Then her back was hurting. A few minutes later, she complained about dizziness. At one point, she even claimed she was having trouble remembering what happened. She sat dramatically on the grass, delivering complaints like a soaked beauty, queen giving a press conference, while everyone around her tried to look concerned. When the deputy arrived, he took one look at the situation, glanced at me, and spoke in an exhausted tone that only small-town law enforcement can perfect. "You got video of this?" I nodded and handed over the trail camera footage. That should have settled everything. Any reasonable person would have accepted the embarrassment, gone home, and spent the next several years pretending the incident never happened. But Karen wasn't a reasonable person. About a week later, a thick envelope showed up in my mailbox. Inside was a lawsuit. Karen was suing me for damage to her ATV, emotional distress, negligence, reckless property modification, and several other complaints that somehow became more ridiculous the farther I read. At one point, she even argued that my pond constituted an environmental hazard. I stood in my kitchen reading the paperwork while my koi swam peacefully outside, completely unaware that they had apparently become part of a legal dispute. And I remember thinking one thing very clearly. This woman couldn't fall down without trying to drag someone else with her. The attorney listed on the complaint was her ex-husband, Darren. That immediately told me 2 things. First, no reputable lawyer wanted anything to do with this case. Second, Karen still believed confidence was a substitute for evidence. The lawsuit was packed with dramatic phrases like malicious terrain design, dangerous property manipulation, and hostile landscape engineering. Reading it felt like watching a soap opera written by somebody who had recently suffered a concussion. It was absurd. Still, I wasn't foolish enough to ignore it. So I called Nina. Years earlier, Nina had served as HOA president before common sense disappeared from the organization. More importantly, she was an attorney, and exactly the type you want on your side when nonsense starts arriving in certified envelopes. She was sharp, patient, and absolutely ruthless when the situation called for it. As it turned out, she already knew Karen. Years before, Karen had become infamous for starting a neighborhood feud over noise regulations and had basically turned herself into a community punchline. When I finished explaining everything, Nina leaned back in her chair, adjusted her glasses, and smiled. "Oh," she said, "I'm definitely taking this case." Meanwhile, Karen was busy documenting her ever-changing injuries online. One week she appeared in a sling. The next week she was wearing a neck brace. A few days later she was suddenly using crutches. The injuries seemed to rotate, depending on the photo. She constantly referred to the crash as the incident, as though she survived a historic natural disaster instead of launching herself off an ATV in front of a dozen witnesses. The internet wasn't buying it. The video clip began circling around town, and before long people were turning Karen into a running joke. I stayed out of all of it. I didn't need to participate. Entitlement is usually capable of embarrassing itself. Then Mitch decided to get involved. Almost immediately, violation notices started appearing. The HOA suddenly had concerns about my pond, then my vegetation, then my drainage work, then the grading on my property. Every complaint seemed to arrive shortly after Karen filed her lawsuit. They wanted fines. They wanted inspections. At one point, they even demanded that I remove the pond entirely. That was when Nina and I headed to the county records office and started pulling every permit connected to my property. What we found changed everything. The pond had existed long before Karen's subdivision was ever developed. Not only was it fully permitted, but years earlier the county had designated it as part of a backup water infrastructure system. In other words, removing could create far more legal problems than leaving it exactly where it was. Suddenly, the entire situation felt different, and then the discovery that truly blew the case wide open arrived. My neighbor Carla had installed one of those wildlife cameras behind her property to record deer, birds, and whatever else wandered through the area. By pure luck, the camera happened to face the perfect direction. It captured the entire ATV stunt from the side. The footage was crystal clear. Honestly, it was even better than my trail camera. You could hear Karen shout, "Watch this!" You could hear her friends cheering. You could hear laughter echoing through the trees. And just before she reached the trench, the recording caught her yelling something even more damaging. "Airborne, baby!" Then came the best part. Right before the jump, with the camera recording every word, Karen laughed and joked her friends. "If I crash, I'm filing a lawsuit." And right behind her, Mitch laughed and added, "Nobody's going to stop us." The second Carla played that footage for us, Nina's expression changed. It was the kind of smile a professional gets when they know the hard part is already over. She folded her arms, watched the clip finish, and said, "That's not evidence. That's the obituary for their case." When court day finally arrived, Karen showed up dressed like the lead character in a tragedy. She walked into the courtroom wearing a neck brace, oversized dark sunglasses, and carrying a thick folder against her chest as though she were transporting state secrets. Darren looked uneasy before proceedings even started. I sat beside Nina feeling strangely relaxed. Not happy, not excited, mostly exhausted. After months of nonsense, I was simply ready for it to be over. The judge entered, took her seat, and within the first few minutes it became obvious she had no patience for theatrics. Darren opened by trying to portray Karen as the innocent victim of an elaborate landscaping trap. I could have sworn I saw the judge's eyebrow twitch. Then Nina stood, calmly, professionally, and without a hint of drama. She laid everything out: property records, county permits, boundary markers, warning signs, documentation of repeated trespassing, records showing the conflict with the HOA. No speeches, no emotional appeals, just one verified fact after another. Then came the videos. First the footage from my trail camera, then Carla's wildlife camera recording. The courtroom grew quiet. Everyone watched as Karen blasted past multiple warning signs, ignored property boundaries, shouted at her friends, launched herself into the air, and crashed into my pond with all the grace of a guided missile powered entirely by arrogance. When the video ended, silence filled the room. It was one of those rare moments where the truth had already spoken for itself and nobody had anything useful left to add. Carla testified next. She was calm, straightforward, and completely believable. Then Karen took the stand. That's when everything unraveled. Instead of sticking to a consistent story, she started improvising. Every answer became more dramatic than the last. She claimed she never saw the signs. She claimed she felt intimidated. She claimed the property was unsafe. At one point, she even suggested my koi fish had behaved aggressively. Yes, aggressive koi. The courtroom actually had to sit through that statement. Nina waited patiently. Then she began dismantling the story piece by piece. She produced photographs showing Karen standing directly beside one of my warning signs a day before the crash. She introduced copies of prior complaints and correspondence. Then she revealed the text message. The text message. The one where Karen bragged about attempting to jump. The one where she joked that if she crashed, she would sue. The one where she quoted Mitch saying nobody could touch her because of his position in the HOA. The atmosphere changed instantly. You could feel it. The judge reviewed the evidence for several moments before delivering her ruling. Karen's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. Permanently. No second attempt. No do-over. No coming back later. With a revised version, the case was finished. But the judge wasn't done. After reviewing the testimony, she referred portions of the matter for additional review because she was not pleased about being misled during legal proceedings. Then she turned her attention toward the HOA situation. She examined the violation notices. She reviewed the timeline. She looked at the sudden flood of citations that appeared only after Karen filed suit, and she saw exactly what Nina had been arguing. The enforcement actions were suspicious. The judge immediately suspended the HOA's ability to pursue those penalties until further review could be completed. Mitch looked like somebody had disconnected the power cord running to his brain. The confidence disappeared right off his face. After that hearing, the entire neighborhood changed. At the next HOA meeting, people finally started speaking openly. Really openly. Residents talked about Karen's constant noise. They talked about the ATV. They talked about her intimidation tactics. They talked about borrowed equipment that never found its way home. They talked about years of behavior everyone had tolerated simply because nobody wanted to become her next target. Once people realized she could be challenged, stories started pouring out. Everyone had won. Mitch tried desperately to protect his position. It didn't matter. The momentum had already shifted. You could feel it happening. Karen made a few final attempts to regain control. There were anonymous complaints, wild accusations, and one especially ridiculous claim involving my pond and fish. None of it worked. County officials started examining how certain complaints and enforcement procedures had been handled, and suddenly all that confidence Karen carried around began evaporating. Funny thing about people who rely on power. Once people stop being afraid of them, they tend to shrink very quickly. After everything settled down, I made a few upgrades to the pond. I installed a fountain, cleaned up the shoreline, added fresh landscaping, and right near the trail, I placed a single sign, private property, respect the splash. Maybe it was petty, maybe it was art. I still haven't decided. What I do know is this: sitting beside that pond afterward with a warm cup of coffee, hearing nothing but moving water instead of ATV engines, felt better than any revenge ever could. The entire experience taught me something I probably should have learned much earlier in life. Some people don't stop because you explain. They don't stop because you ask nicely. And they definitely don't stop because you give them endless chances. They stop when facts catch up with them. They stop when evidence exists. They stop when the truth gets documented and placed where everyone can see it. Boundaries matter. Documentation matters. And real dignity is much stronger than the loudest person in the room. Several months later, Karen returned one last time. She came on foot. No ATV. No audience. No dramatic performance. She stood outside my property line holding paperwork and asked for mutual release forms so everything could finally end. She looked different. Smaller somehow. Worn down. Like all that anger had finally exhausted itself. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was probably the closest thing she was capable of offering. I let Nina review the paperwork. I signed it.